You one by one as they stand to the podium to present their speech. I have my presentation, my piece of paper somewhere. Where is it? So we have one of our speakers is not here yet, but we can add them together. Daniel? Okay, so everybody's ready on this panel. As I said, the name of this topic is called Do Perceptions Build a Reality? And what we want is to approach the role of social perception and the satisfaction in the construction of public policies. The objective is to understand how subjective well-being generates a psychosocial reality by constructing realities and objective well-being. The speakers are Carmelo Vázquez, a Spanish psychologist, professor at the Complutense University of Madrid, and president of the National Society of Positive Psychology, Daniel Martínez Aldunate. Sorry. Mr. Aldunate, Chilean psychiatrist, director of the Institute of Wellbeing. If you are going to listen to the translation, could you please raise your hand? Raise your hand if you're going to listen to the translation. Otherwise, translation will be available upon request by the table of interpretation, by the booth, interpretation booth, and translation will be available on demand. If you please raise your hand if you're going to listen to the translation. We are going to be checking if people need interpretation. So if you please raise your hand if you're going to listen to the interpretation. Simultaneous interpretation will be available upon request. If you please can approach the translation booth, we will be very happy to provide interpretation services. Thank you. And we have to remember that Bhutan, this little country, has influenced in a decisive manner the public policies that have been taken and some of the public policies that have been most important for social matters. Naturally, this is part of many initiatives that exist at world level. They have been long quoted this day, and I'm going to be very accurate about what I will say. There is an academic movement from professionals, from institutions that are working on well-being, and they are making of it their new flagstaff. So New Horizon is there for public policies to follow in these initiatives, in international and national initiatives. There are the European Union with a program that goes beyond the GDP, the United Kingdom as well with new measurements for their population in order to try to monitor what their well-being of their citizens is. And we have heard about some others this morning. Also, additionally, there are many institutions, Gallup, the OECD, that have tried to install as well as many indexes, and they have tried to instill measurements to measure through different methodologies and approaches with academic background that varies, and they have tried to create these measurements in order to sustain that happiness can be measurable. If we can measure it, we will be able to change. If we cannot measure, it will be impossible to know if we are changing it. And also with social initiatives that impact largely. And they have talked about Bhutan, but very near here you have the example of Tech Millennium, which is one of the most appealing in the current academic world. But what we are trying to find when we measure well-being, we try to find reliable measurements that are linked to theories that are consistent. The well-being theory is by the moment very much descriptive. We still need to develop this further, and this will take decades. The science will take too long, and the knowledge about well-being is only a baby. And undoubtedly there's going to be changes, there's going to be important changes, as it will be for any scientific field for the next years and decades. By now they are very descriptive theories, but despite this being descriptive, indicators should be linked to theoretical elements. You cannot come here and suddenly create an indicator because today you think it is important. It might be, but it should be linked to a more consistent method that are valid. This is something we experts normally don't refer to. If somebody says it has high level of scores, is it truly possible? This is psychometric mostly, and this affects psychology and any other social aspects, but this is the last barrier we have to face. So this is a complicated issue, knowing truly if what we are measuring is truly measuring what we intend to measure. And finally, this should be measures that should add something on what we already know. There is a paradox, and part of my intervention is trying to explain our intents from the last few years in order to capture this, what we call happiness, through a very simple metrics that assess human well-being, but it's very appealing that indicators proliferate, indexes proliferate. OECD's, Gallup, ours is at a much smaller scale, but there are very few comparison studies that are able to prove what works better. So these seem to be autonomous worlds that have no connection amongst themselves. But I think then that we urgently need comparison research, comparative research that will tell us what's good of each indicator, and something that we call incremental validity from psychometric standpoint for each of these indicators. So we have also heard, and we have heard today about measuring human progress. Economic measurements that we have seen, they are very myopic, they are short-sighted, and they are not measuring what we consider important from experience, from the human experience standpoint. And we have tried to overcome this by creating compound indexes. It's not only the GDP, not only the income, but also including other external objective measurements. And probably in the last decade, we have reached some kind of consensus that we have to ask people, and what people tell us is valuable. We should not, we should trust what people say. When we started 20 years ago studying human well-being, many of our colleagues were very skeptical because this was subjective, and subjective things seem to be difficult to measure. But medicine, for example, medicine is based on pain, on a pain score, and pain is the same as happiness or well-being. It's subjective. Medicine is built upon an element that is totally subjective, and there are no obstacles to have created a science that has created something that we have not. Units that can be used in different individuals. Very briefly, the creator of the idea of the GDP, Simon Kuznets, Nobel awarded economist, somehow despite the fact that he was proud of his indicator, we need to take into account, this is very recent, from the 1970s it was started being used as a unit of progress for countries. He was very skeptical, he himself. He said this was an indicator that in last it could not be able to gather all the data about the wealth, and there have been economists that have truly followed to the letter this indicator that as viable, as reliable, when it only gathers something that relates to a small aspect of human to the human well-being and performance. But the UN, and I'm going to be very succinct about this, they try to create this index for human development, and they say it includes aspects of life, education, and economic wealth of a country. But honestly, if we include human development, if we compare a map that has, today we have seen many maps that include colors, and I hope there is no people who suffer from daltonism because you might be totally unaware of what has been said. But if we observe the geographical distribution of human development and we compare it to the index, to the geographical distribution of the GDP, what this gives us is very similar maps. So similar because the correlation between both indexes is very big. It oscillates from 0.7 to 0.9, depending to each study. But human development indexes are not a good alternative to measure human development. And this is where we have measurements that relate to subjectivity. But this is another example on quality of life indicators. There are many institutions and many organizations. This army of ants that you get to see here, this is a classification from countries from Iceland to so many countries that are qualified in terms of quality of life, but with objective components. And another item here that gives us interesting information about the countries, it tells us where are located in terms of health, education. This is Spain. Spain is doing very well in terms of life expectancy. It's a fourth or a fifth country ranked in life expectancy, but in terms of education, democracy, peace, it ranked lower. So it gives us a radiograph of the strength and quality of life of the countries. And it is very interesting talking this morning to one of the speakers. We have Iceland ranked first, ranked at the top of this classification, but it is true that reality is so multiple and very complex. Iceland appears ranked at every measurement of happiness. It appears ranked amongst the 5 top. Iceland is also the country with the largest consumption of antidepressant medicine. So reality is so complex, and being able to measure it only through some parameters could really conceal some aspects that are important as well for considering a country as a whole. And it is true that one of the things I don't like at all is that indexes are used to rank. I think these indexes should not be used to rank countries, and this has been, it is been said a lot. It is like competition amongst countries, and also to brag about and to prove that we are a country that progresses more. This can be criticized, and we are in this implicit moment and where we try to prove cultural primacy, and this is totally inadequate. People have said that these human development parameters tells us how far we are as Scandinavians. That is to say, it measures how Scandinavian a country is. And I'm being an extremist. We should be careful in terms of using indexes just in a mechanical way. So this is where we have subjective measurements playing a role, and they are necessary, undoubtedly. But another thing is that we need to hit the right key so we are able to assess this properly with components that are deeply human, deeply involved with with human well-being, and there have been some intents to measure life satisfaction. Under one item, as it has been said with a report provided by the UN, the World Report on Happiness, they use indicators of one single item. Not for that, or not based on that, they are trivial. They are important, but there are many measures that have been developed, not only single item measures, but several items, measurements, life satisfaction, and all that. And many of these measurements have been used or have been created by many institutions like the World Value Survey or Ecovalometer. Repeat some questions, or also in Eurobarometry, and also in Canada they have used their scales to monitor the well-being of their citizens. So this has become commonplace, not only for the institutions but also for companies as well, and for countries to ask their citizens about their well-being. And as I said earlier, it is not superficial to ask people how satisfied they feel about life. Such a simple question that seems rather vulgar. It is a question that relates not only to the wealth, it relates to many other indicators, to human rights violation, to corruption levels perceived in one country. It correlates to availability of social capital and trust, and also to health, both physical and mental. There are comparison studies that we have performed in Spain.
This study was carried out in Spain 2-3 years ago, and what really bothers me is the idea that all those, like myself, that focus on the positive are not focused on the negative. I am a negative psychologist, if I may use that term, because I am interested in pain. I am interested in human pain and sorrow. I am truly interested in understanding how, from the well-being perspective, we can alleviate the human being. When it comes to mental diseases and physical illnesses, we now know that depression has a cost, a very high cost, on the vital satisfaction, which is a tremendous scope, much more than a chronic disease. And the physical and mental diseases state that the mental ones have a greater impact when it comes to the large scale. So we pay attention to physical illnesses, but an authentic political clause should never put aside the mental conditions. We have the yin and the yang. We have to have both sides of the coin. We cannot forget that pain and sorrow are part of the human comedy, the tragedy that we live on a daily basis. And when we talk about well-being policies, we need to include those. We need to have the perception of human not well-being, the upsetting aspects. For example, Violeta Parra was mentioned before because of her song, and she talked about life and thanking life, but she also talked about the cursing and the star, how she curses the star, for example, when it's not present and it's dark outside. And she also talks about how life can include several aspects. We can have pleasure, pain, we can have many human aspects included. Now, when we talk about theories, we need to include the components. On the one hand, emotional well-being, which are emotions and vital satisfaction, but the eudaimonia, which includes the strengths, competences, and anything that we can develop in a full life arena. An additional leg of this well-being that has been mentioned in previous conferences has to do with, for example, the social trust, and not from the material perspective, but furthermore, connecting us to all those elements that make us be interconnected, the sense of belonging, the sense of trust, and how we can be part of a society that on the one hand protects us and covers for us, covers our back. And that is part of those emotional linkage that we have. the social linkage. And when it comes to social support, we have course elements that are tangible, but we also have some elements that are not tangible. For example, the psychological social benefit or social impact that should always be part of any comprehensive program. A couple of years ago, I was fortunate to be part of the European Social Survey for the well-being module, and Felicia Harpert and Jordi Bisset and Nick Martz were part of this module. And this is an attempt, a European attempt, that with 43 questions that are posted on the internet, and data will be available for any researcher that might want to have access to it. And access can be granted to the whole picture regarding vital satisfaction, positive and negative emotions, and eudaimonic elements, as well as social elements. And finally, we have a concept that is important in any survey. What activities people perform to feel good, to feel happy. We have included very simple elements. For example, being active all the time, being connected all the time, being connected to the people all the time, and offer oneself as a comprehensive part of the human well-being. And by a show of hand, could you indicate if you request simultaneous interpretation into English? Please raise your hand if you are listening to the translation into English. We are about to wrap up this session, and we would like to know if simultaneous interpretation into English is required. Please show your hand if that is the case. So we will continue to provide the service. Thank you. We will continue. We will continue with this happiness index then. We're about to wrap up, but we have the sensitive measurement. Most of them are translations of scales or scores. And here we have, for example, a copy or a resemblance of what happens in other countries. We believe that we can get aid from this type of programs that are elsewhere implemented. Instead of that, we have worked on this conceptual approach with empirical questions so that we can create our own tool, which is a multi-component type of perspective, and that it can be valid. I will not go in detail. This is an instrument, this is the Pemberton Happiness Index, that talks about well-being from a hedonic standpoint. We have also 6 questions that are eudaimonic, and 1 that has to do with vital well-being. And we also have personal growth, 1 additional question regarding the control, the sensation of control, and 1 for the experience well-being. And finally, we have the social well-being. And the question has to do with to what extent you are part of a society that allows you to grow as a human being. So all this information has to be adjusted to a society, a community, a country. And this index has another aspect that is a unique one, given that it covers for all the well-being aspects that are mandated. Likewise, this information has also been included in the Gallup poll. And questions regarding what happened to you yesterday. Not so much the emotion, but furthermore, the experiences that happened to you yesterday, and positive situations, that is. For example, I felt very proud about this, or I learned something that's pretty interesting. I carry out something that I really enjoyed. And on the other side, we have 5 negative aspects. I felt bored most of the time, or a great deal of the day, or I felt overcome or overwhelmed. And these are experiences, sets of experiences that are affective, positive or negative, that is, on the previous day. These questions have been included. When constructing the sample, we have 9 countries with 6 different translations of the items included. We validated the items with reference original frameworks. This was humongous work. We have empirical data, and we have 11 items that you can see on the screen right now, well selected and from an empirical perspective, based on correlation data of the item with its pertaining reference line. So it's a unique criteria selection when constructing a new index or a scale that attempts to evaluate satisfaction. And finally, well, this is I want to express that this scale works pretty well. As a matter of fact, as well or even better than other type of scales. For example, the dinner vital scale. And this was a recent study that we wrapped up a month ago. And 1 week ago, we started analyzing data with 14,000 people based on this scale through the internet users, that is, people that have 40% or more of internet penetration. And I wanted to share information during this remaining 44 seconds. Data that might be interesting in Mexico and in Costa Rica, which are both countries on the top. They are above the average. We have 6.84, and the average is 10. This is the overall average I am referring to. And Asian countries such as Japan and Korea, South Korea that is, are in the tail. We have measured up. Well, I had some graphs about this. I do believe that this is interesting information. Mexico is a very particular and unique country. Mexico and Costa Rica, for example, have the satisfaction component and positive memories and remembrances of life, which are positive. But experiences, emotional experiences, are also positive when it comes to the day before action. When we ask people, especially here in Mexico more than in Costa Rica, what happened yesterday, people inform very positive or report very positive results as opposed to negative ones. And contrary to what happens in Japan, negative experiences are intensely from an emotional perspective. However, when we compare what happened yesterday, what happened to you yesterday is less subject to memory or distortions. Furthermore, to distortions to please the interviewer. Now, when we ask for the French mostly say that they had a great day, they ate some cheese, they had a good wine, and of course they made love. Of course, they always say that. And life and its vision, it's pretty negative. And so on the one hand, we have the memory or the memoir that takes us back to the well-being and the actual experience. Contrary to that is Brazil. In Brazil, people say that they do well. However, their day-to-day experience is pretty amazing when it comes to the negative thing. We are overwhelmed by this result. Apparently, they are overwhelmed by many concerns. 80% of the interviewees said that yesterday they were concerned about a personal situation, an intensive one. And as a wrap-up, let me tell you that well-being should be measured up from the complexity it represents, because we are facing complexity. We need multiple measures. We need to understand that there's simultaneous data. For example, not only what people think about their happiness, but what people do with regards to their happiness. And there's no such thing as a better element as opposed to the other ones. No, that's not the case. We need to predict. We need to understand what the predictors are. I believe that's the challenge ahead of us. And the little prince said, well, heard from the little fox, that important things can only be measured up with the heart. And I believe that the important things can be seen with the heart, and we can attempt, or try at least, to get closer to the heart of the people, at least having the courtesy to ask something that has not been frequently done in social sciences. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Carmelo Vasquez, Professor Carmelo Vasquez. Before we continue with Daniel Martinez, I have an announcement. Dinner will be sponsored by the government of the state of Jalisco, and as soon as we finish this panel, there will be buses outside the hotel to take you there. Next, we have Daniel Martinez Aldunate. He's head of the Institute of Wellbeing, and he's part of the Sharing Happiness Network. He organizes the dialogues for happiness and what can be done to be happier in Chile today. He's also a member of the happiness group in the Aconcagua Summit. Thank you. First and foremost, I would like to thank the invitation to this event, which is unique. It's one of its kind in Latin America, and I will try to give you ideas that could provide us with parameters understanding the mental health. And this is part of information from my psychiatric profile. Without any doubt, we have the media for the language expression that are telling us what's happening in the world. The media is telling us what's happening in the world. So very frequently we have an alarming type of scope. We watch the news and we always see the negative all the times. So there's a perception that is based on fear or threatening aspects. In addition to language, we have to know that feelings and emotions and the transitory as opposed to the permanent also taint and temper with the reality. It's important to know that on a good day or on a bad day you see things differently, and there's also the mood or the temperament that makes you feel bad or suicidal or happy, and those feelings of course converge. We also need to understand what the reality places ahead of us, what the reality states. We need to know that the perspective has to be a real one and not the ideal one. Without any doubt, there's public policies that are based on all these aforementioned aspects, and the day-to-day reality imposes what we live. For example, we have the votes and social movements which show what the reality is. Once we have the votes and this, for example, social meetings or social riots, we have La Gioconda, which says, smile, tomorrow it's going to be worse. So language builds on reality. And we will continue with the presentation. So, before we heard from the meeting of the group that cried out this morning as a sign of protest, I wanted to make a comment from the human side, from that emotion. But now I understand that we cannot shut up, we cannot be quiet, and we have to cry out loud. We have to know what happens. And what's hurting Mexico now, it's hurting all the countries as well. This has happened in other countries, in our countries. So we hurt, and we understand that we hurt. We have to cry whenever we hurt. However, the important thing is to always integrate the good and the bad. We can openly say that what happened in Mexico hurts us and damages us, but at the same time, we need to celebrate that we are here together, sitting around a table for discussion to talk about happiness and hope. It's important to know that we need to integrate realities. We need to be coherent and we need to be logical when setting forward the parameters and the standards of the society. We have Odo Marquardt in the year 2006 who wrote the happiness of the unhappiness. And he says that whatever is human possible is not the perfect happiness, but rather the imperfect happiness. Happiness of the unhappiness. And as Carmelo stated before me, we need to take these scopes, these views, and put them together. We need to focus on competences. We need to work on what we can do and what we can't do. We have to also put in the picture what's good, what's bad, negative emotions, positive emotions. So somebody that has a negative emotion and with an ill will have it more complicated to lead a happy life. Hence, it's important to always take into consideration what happens to the human beings. Likewise, I also wanted to mention another factor for the construction of the reality. This is a song composed by Silvio Rodriguez. He said, and I quote, "I am happy, I am a happy man, and I want all the death to forgive me for my happiness." When we talk about the common concept of happiness, we understand that it can be the lack of happiness or unhappy emotion of other beings. And some beings can be happier when others aren't. We need to understand that. We need to try to project happiness based on all those groups we share our moments with. That's an ecosystem. It's a wide scope when it comes to happiness. It's the happiness of the ecosystem, if you will. And in Chile, we have a number of studies, and over the past 5 years, there has been a great deal of research and evidence to support this. But in the year 2012, we have the United Nations Development Plan, and the first line of conclusions include the fact that Chileans feel satisfied with our life, our daily lives, but we are unsatisfied with many social aspects. Of course, this was surprising and compelling when it comes to the contradiction it states. I will not go in depth, however, I would like to underscore one of the results of this study. Apparently, in Chile, there's a major need to give more weight on subjectivity, which is somehow represented in mental health. When we talk about well-being and happiness, we talk about the mental health. Without mental health or a good state of mind, we cannot have complete or comprehensive development. So our mental health is of utmost importance and relevance. This study also responds to the happiness question from 0 to 10. And when we segment by social classes, we only have 8% of happiness. Only 8% indicating that they are very glad, very happy. But when we go to segments D and E, which are the lowest in the social classification, they go somewhere around 6%. So, I'm sorry, 40% indicates that they are at level 6 or 6 in this rank. So, we have socioeconomical incomes that help people acquire or purchase goods or assets. However, there's inequity, and this type of study clearly shows inequity. We have heard about inequity quite often during the panels, the previous panels, and every time we have access to health, access to education, everybody said the same. We have people in the lowest levels of the society have less possibility or likelihood to be happy. So the society combines how the world is understood, and the world has a different face. For example, you have a model that indicates that with 50% of positive emotions, which are genetically represented, apparently you are born with a tendency or a pattern to well-being or the unhappiness or unhappy state. So you are born with it, and then you develop it as you grow older. And then we have diversity. We have to know that development models can be created based on the democracy that they share in parallel, and minorities as well as majorities should be included, people that have differences. And the mental health is a factor that should be borne in mind as well when analyzing this standpoint. Marx and Engels, when questioning personality factors, posted a question, an important one. Marx said that fighting would be an answer, and Engels said a good Chateau Marteau, 1848. So when listening to Marx and Engels, we understand the way they respond to the happiness question. So we might look alike, but we respond differently. So we need to work on happiness and well-being, and there's a great open question that has not been solved yet by the science and research. If you are an introvert, an extrovert, impulsive, or if you are self-controlled, self-contained, how do you respond to happiness? How do you respond to well-being? Well, this is based on your personality, on your temper and personality. This same study, under the United Nations Development Program, allocated in Chile, there was an interesting question, an additional question, asking what does reality depend on different socioeconomic groups. And based on the research for all the groups, the relevant connections are of utmost importance. But for the higher groups, for example, A, B1, the higher socioeconomic groups, there's a great emphasis on the personal development and the sense of life or meaning of life and accomplishing the goals. On the contrary, we have the lower income sectors, and happiness in those groups is placed on a quiet life, a peaceful life. So we talk about tranquility, we talk about not being threatened or seeing into the basic needs on a daily basis. And that's what happiness and well-being stand for when analyzing these groups. And then we have this model, which is so known by most of us. And we need to scale on this pyramid, but in order to do so, we need to be quiet. We have to have peace of mind before we worry or are concerned about an additional topic. So when having peace of mind, we can accomplish our goals. And the goal accomplishment is the top of the pyramid, in fact. There's a number of different ways to get closer to this well-being and happiness and the connection with the mental health. However, there's a definition pertaining to the year 2014 under the WHO. And definition states that the mental health is a well-being status during which the individual comes to realize his or her own aptitudes, and he can confront or face and tackle normal pressures in life, working productively and usefully, and he or she has the possibility and opportunities to develop his or her dreams, and he or she is capable of contributing to the society. So he or she is part of the society. He or she has the sense of belonging. And mental health, from this definition, is truly in parallel with what the happiness and well-being stand for. We have awareness, we have integration, social integration, and other aspects that have been covered so far. There was a contest some time ago asking what was wrong about the world, or what is wrong in the world. Furthermore, there's a question regarding what has to be changed so the world can be a better one. And we can give an answer, or we can reply to these two questions by mentioning everything that has been said so far. For example, wars and plagues and fights, economic crisis, and so forth. But there was a simple answer. And the answer is, what is wrong in the world? Myself. I am wrong. And if we put this in a collective perspective, it would be us. What's wrong in the world? We are. We are wrong. Or I am wrong. We need to create public policies that give a possibility for people to have a pathway they can follow on, and we have to take on responsibility. We have to be held accountable so that we can actually look for happiness and well-being. This is in part responsible of the individual, not the society. And lately, there's the emotional development that is part of the happiness well-being formula. And there's an emotional illiteracy, or a relational or interrelation illiteracy. We have been living a great deal of problems and many indicators I will not mention, otherwise I will fill you up with numbers and figures. And this is the Chilean reality, so it's useless to give you the data. But it's important to understand the psychosomatic problems. We do not acknowledge, we do not recognize that there's a problem inside of us. And we have pathologies that are psychosomatic. We have, for example, headaches, we have lumbar pain, we have irritable colon, and a number of pathologies that as soon as we understand what these diseases and ailments are all about, we can we can put them inside, and we can be insightful as to how to control them. Otherwise, we will perpetuate and maintain the emotional illness. We need to acknowledge them. Otherwise, we can understand how people disconnect from the others, and this is part of the structural stages. For example, narcissist personalities. It's important to always work at early stages during the childhood, as Alejandro Aldrich said, during the childhood stages, at early stages or elementary school age, scholar age. We have people that dissociate themselves from the society, or people that do not understand what's happening, and they start to turn on and turn off. They connect themselves, they disconnect themselves, and this is what's normally seen as the impulsivity, emotional impulsiveness. And it's a psychopathology that is being applied to common behaviors, combining emotions, and there's a convulsion, there's a seriousness when it comes to the life that these people are leading. And at the end of the day, what happens is that we act out on these diseases, and this is a disadaptive type of behavior, and we no longer understand what's happening. We no longer have an idea as to how to control things, and this is important when it comes to analyzing what's happening to us. We need to become aware. So when we somatize or psychosomatize these diseases, I would like to make reference to the following. This is a factor that has been developed in the Western countries, for instance in Chile, and that is materialism. When we understand materialism, is to focus our lives on something that is externalized, something that is not part of me. The problem with materialism is that as long as I always focus on that external aspect, I will no longer be worried about the internal part of me. This is one of the many problems that materialism presents itself with. We have the personal materialism, and we have the social materialism, and other indicators, for example, subjective well-being, and other elements that we could mention here. However, from a simple perspective, the most important factor is that I should not set aside my interior, my person, myself, and understand that what happens from the inside will define what the most important things are. That inside will create the connection that has a meaning in life. So one of the major topics when analyzing this has to do with the fact that it's important to coexist with the material world, of course, but we cannot transform ourselves. We need to stop consuming, because consumption consumes us.
So now thinking about the last ideas, talking about the last ideas, we have been talking about some negative aspects. What would happen if I don't get to know my emotion of, or if they materialize? But if I take this from the fact that I am able to realize my emotions, or I manage to have positive emotions as optimism. And I want to point out how important realistic optimism is. It is non-denying the future. The present, I'm sorry. If something aches, I cannot deny it. I can postpone it, delay it. But what is realistic optimism about is that I have the hope that tomorrow things might change. And why might they change? Because I can do things to change my personal life, because I'm part of that human group that can support each other to change things. And somebody can help me and orient me about how to change. And there are circumstances that change scenarios independently from our actions. Now, why is it so important to rely on positive optimism, realistic optimism? If I'm living a moment that I think is bad, that's everything, and I have no hope into the future. I have no reason to move on. And if we forget about expectations in the future, these are going to be the most difficult times in our life. When we think that life has no sense and make no sense, we can postpone decisions for self-aggression. And one of the great topics that positive psychology has worked on pre-adolescence is a realistic positivism in order to take life from this stance. And getting to my last set of ideas, I have to say that undoubtedly Emotions are contagious, and there is collective responsibility. We can create human environment for well-being and bad being. We feel tension and negative feelings, and also we are able to feel positive feelings, and we want to be there it is. And also trust. This is one of the biggest elements related to well-being, and we know that the lack of trust has become important to many other societies. And my last slides, I want to make a brief comment regarding time. Undoubtedly, one of the basic items is how, in terms of the perception of reality, is how we manage time. It could be that we might know very well about what makes us good, but we feel we don't have time to do that, or the society where we live at doesn't provide us with time. This is basic for well-being, how I manage my time or manage myself in regards to time. Another aspect related to time is when I feel that this time I'm able to be autonomous and have freedom to make small tweaks in my time management. And now I cannot longer set my time. I have no more time to tell you this, but I want to give you an idea. And this is when we want to say, well, I want 5 more minutes to rest, to enjoy the present. The freedom to be able to enjoy 5 more minutes is also linked to happiness. And the third time-related matter here is the speed by which we currently live at. We live so quickly that we forget the important aspects. Emotions are only seen when we make a stop for them to appear. If we live so quickly, the first thing we lose is emotions. Emotions are only going to be seen when we render ourselves with time. It is when we are walking so quickly in the street. It is so different when we walk slowly. And this is my very last slide. It is only when we walk slowly that we get to see some realities. And the last piece of information I want to share with you is this vision. I don't know if you say this, but in vision, we say, in Chile we say we are happier than a dog with 2 tails. The fact is that when a dog is happy, shakes the tail. So shaking 2 tails is being happier. So it is true of the good things we need a lot, but we need to be careful because we might be so unhappy if we have 3 tails. 3 tails is bothersome, and this is the question: how much is enough to be happy? Because happiness can also become a never-ending race to search for external things that make us happy, and establishing and setting many goals, and we never attain, and we are never able to enjoy what we have. And in time, we could get to the time where we are happier than a dog with half a tail, because in due time we are going to learn to live with loss. And living in many instances, we will have to live with half a tail, and we will need to be happy anyway. Now I'm going to yield the floor to Ms. Paloma. She has a PhD from the Autonomous University of Mexico. She has a master degree. She has obtained a medal, Gabino Barreda medal, and it relates to the quality of life. She's researcher at the professor at the Universidad Iberoamericana. Good evening. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this forum for their invitation. I think this kind of fora are going to plant the seeds of so many uncertainties related to well-being, and then we will be able to harvest the fruits of all this that we hope can be seen as a way of public policies, all that we are reflecting upon today. This work I'm going to present to you, this work has its focus on the work of 10 years of research on well-being. I have worked mostly on well-being related to poverty, related to socioeconomic level, and subjective conditions of life. So this paper is mostly about a reflection on these topics and how they relate. And also we have included In this reflection, social mobility, the social mobility of the poorest. And also we include attributions about poverty and socioeconomic level where individuals are placed, and how the socioeconomic level where individuals are placed relates directly, first of all, to well-being, and also to how this class identification can also intervene in the social mobility experienced by individuals themselves. And additionally, quality of life conditions and well-being related can be mediated by the attributions of individuals in terms of the root causes of poverty. So as I said, it refers to the empirical evidence obtained in 10 years of work. And basically, as I said, I am going to approach mostly poverty identification to a specific economic level, subjective attributions to poverty, progress, and social mobility. And I will talk about some predictors of subjective well-being. And I'm going to skip some things due to time-related issues. We know that research on subjective well-being had its origins 4 decades ago, and some of the basic questions that appeared from the beginning of the study of subjective well-being is: what are the most important determinants of subjective well-being? To what measures economic well-being can relate to subjective well-being? And this is a question that continues to encourage us to continue to study these variables. Is it possible that an individual or a country has subjective well-being when the most basic needs of the peoples of these countries is compromised? And also, these kind of questions have motivated lots of research, and many indicators or many variables have tried to explain subjective well-being, trying to address these questions. So I want to start by saying that research where the objective has been to compare several economic indicators as well as subjective well-being have found that material abundance of individuals or countries is provide larger subjective well-being. It is true for these countries, and this has been an outcome that we have seen throughout all these years. Countries that have better life conditions, better conditions of life, better health, and larger life expectancy, they prove to have larger levels of subjective well-being. However, when we bring down to earth our study about this kind of, or when we correlate these indicators about material conditions of life and subjective well-being in countries like Mexico, we have been able to find, as Vasquez and Arbaz have reported, high scores on life satisfaction and subjective happiness in Mexican population. In other countries is similar. However, I approach mostly Mexican case.
We have heard about this data from the National Bureau of Geography and Statistics, and we have seen high levels or indicators of happiness in overall life, given that almost half of male and female citizens report 9 or 10 when the scale is 0 to 10. However, we need to know that there's a factor really calls our attention, and this has been widely discussed, and that is that high levels of subjective well-being should be understood from the perspective of crime rates and violence indicators, as well as poverty in Mexico over the past years. So there's a incoherence there. So this type of results or contrast leads to the following question. We have to include this information as part of the research so that we can understand what the proper mechanisms are, mechanisms through which people can have well-being levels, they can reach well-being well-being living, despite the fact that the conditions are adverse. The analysis I will refer to comprises data from samples throughout the past 10 years, and given that I have very short time to give you this presentation, I will not elaborate on the results. Basically, we are talking about general population samples as well as teachers and professor samples. And some states talk about the opportunities program, or Programa Oportunidades, which is a nationwide program. And one moment, I want to move the slide. And data from a national survey that also pertain to this Oportunidades program. So the first variable I would like to correlate here has to do with the subjective well-being. And these national samples and different samples I have referred to before have stated over and over that people that live below the poverty line, when talking about well-being, they feel satisfied. They feel satisfied when it comes to the happiness levels. We have also evaluated the appreciation of wealth. And as I have mentioned before, when it comes to satisfaction with life or satisfaction of their lives, there's an average between 9 and 10. So people really feel happy. And when we contrast that, or compare that rather, to the wealth appreciation, the average is at 4, is set at 4 from 1 to 10 rank wise. So people in the below the poverty line feel happier as opposed to how poor they are. They don't feel rich, they don't feel wealthy, but they do feel happy. So this gives us a better idea as to how results are not overestimated, generalized overstatement. So there's not a generalized happiness feeling. I have 11 minutes to continue with my presentation, but I somehow lost the next slide. I apologize for that. We have also talked and evaluated the socio-economical level, or the social class. For example, very poor, moderately poor, mildly poor, or poor. The literature has made the reference to the socio-economical level that not always corresponds to the social class or social classification, for that matter. And the social classification is a better predictor for the mental health, physical health, and subjective well-being. This variable is interesting, I believe, because in forums such as this one, we have insisted on the fact that there has to be a legitimate subjective well-being, as well as the class identification, which in turn is a subjective indicator that allows us to have a better idea as to how subjectivity is more powerful as opposed to the conditions of life to predict well-being and happiness. So some results based on this variable includes that subjective well-being in some dominions, for example, the interfamiliar relationships as well as leisure time, allowed for better prediction when identifying the social classes, in order to know whether people felt poor or not poor, regardless of the material conditions they live within. Now, all those that did not consider themselves to be poor had better well-being subjective indexes in variables related to psychological resources, for example, social support, or greater better coping with stress, and better relationship at work, or better relationship with their partner, with their spouses, with their children, and the susceptibility when it comes to their friends and social relations from a general perspective. We could also evidence that class identification, as well as economical indexes, for example, incomes and job positions and job profiles, had a very low correlation or a moderate correlation. So from low to moderate. Likewise, there was very little concordance or concurrence between the real perception and the class identification where they were locating themselves or positioning themselves. Another interesting variable that we have measured up over these past years has to do with poverty attributions or attributes. And in order to understand this, we ask people to indicate which causes they attributed their poverty to, and these were the causes 3 times. All in all, one had to do with individual or internal causes, the other one had to do with social or external causes, and finally we have luck or fatalism, fate, that is. Now, research findings showed that poverty blamed to individual causes were more satisfied. I have to state that all the population was poor, very poor. Now, the research results show that all those that attributed their poverty levels to individual causes were happier, much happier than those that attributed this to external causes. For example, blame it on the government, blame it on God, or blame God, blame destiny, blame fate, and so forth. So the explanation for this type of results takes us back to the external causes. External causes does not allow for control, and people are upset. So when feeling poor, there's the perception as to their own capabilities or skills and the way they cope with poverty and how they tackle problems, the self-esteem and other factors. Now, individualities are beneficial, given that people reported that they were less sick, less illness symptoms, and they could improve their overall life conditions, given that they would, it was up to them to be better off. Now, over the past 10 years, we have evaluated social mobility of individuals with the Oportunidades program, this opportunity program that has been implemented for some time now, and more satisfied people are those that have had more positive mobility. And as a matter of fact, we worked on a cohort for comparison purposes, and we evaluated people that have gone past beyond the poverty line and that have improved their conditions but have not gone beyond that poverty line, and there were significant differences in different dominions or arenas amongst both groups and or between both groups. That in turn makes us believe that feeling better or feeling good favors the life conditions.
And this might be a circular way of work. More mobility provokes more well-being, and subsequently there is a creation of a virtuous circle. So, let me see. Well, I don't know. Another subject that we have studied in an important manner has been about predictors. Predictors for subjective well-being. And my screen is moving, sorry. About subjective well-being predictors, what I would like to show you now is this is a result of a modeling that we made where we are able to see what factors for a national sample that includes people in extreme poverty, how these predictors allow us to predict satisfaction levels. And we get to see that the squares by the right are the variables that basically relate to positive affect, personal competencies, family support, relational support, resilience, emotional strength, being able to face direct stress, encouragement to achieve things. And we have other variables related to negative effect as stress, depression, social disadjustment. And we get to see that variables or the variables that best express satisfaction are related to social support, as family and social support, for example. Another variable that we named that is very much latent that we have called strength is related to motivation, to emotional intelligence, and so on. And negatively, we have the arrow that is about or addressing some other negative things as depression, lack of adjustment. And social support doesn't relate directly to satisfaction, but it relates to negative effect as well as a strength. So it has negative, indirect effect on satisfaction. So, okay. So, as a way of conclusion, we could say that the styles to face stress, as a general conclusion from these studies of 10 years, we can say that the style to face stress, the way to address problems, self-control, were predictors that were consistent throughout the samples, as well as those related to negative effect. Relation between subjective well-being and stress has been complex, because despite we know that the larger subject well-being is related to less stress in some countries that are wealthier, it is also true that better life conditions link together to less stress. The better life conditions link to more stress. So it is a very complex relationship to this. What we have found is that the role that facing stress, the style stress is faced, is very important. It is not only if we have, whether we have or not, or whether we are living life under stress or not, but what's the style by which we face stress. We say we are all stressed. The difference is how we face it and how we manage it or deal with it. And another very interesting topic is religiousness. We also measured religiousness, and we got to see how it links to well-being. In the literature, it is said that the higher levels of religiousness or religiosity link to higher subjective well-being, and we were able to observe through different samples throughout many years that high religious levels link to or become external causes. What happens to me has to do with God, and I have nothing to do with it, so that was negatively directed to less well-being. And on the other hand, lack of religiousness links, at least in Mexico, links to some kind of hopelessness, some degree of hopelessness. So we found that moderate level of stress were the most beneficial to this population, because not everything is set to the hands of God, but also when we are not able to deal with our problems on our own, we have a resource to somebody we can ask for help. So, in general, results about this work support the premise that economic well-being is related to subjective well-being. However, when data is analyzed from only extreme poverty, we do not find lack of subjective well-being or lack or problems from the psychological standpoint. When we study subjective levels of well-being, we see that there are factors that express this more consistently. Specifically at these studies, we found variables related to personal competencies that allow people to face life in a better way, and despite the fact that the research is still there's still so much to do. There are aspects we need to explore. Despite the fact that we know that subjective well-being is more in wealthier countries and more developed countries, it is necessary to know how poor people in countries like in Mexico achieve to be so happy. This is a question that is worth mentioning, worth asking ourselves. And on the other side, in the same regards, it is not that we believe it is impossible to be happy if you are poor, when there are some other factors that compensate economic lack. However, when individual conditions, family and social conditions are very, very adverse, it is possible that there are self-protection psychological and social mechanisms that safeguard the integrity of individuals, but we need to perform more research under this line so we are able to see what mechanisms are there that, to face adversity. And just to conclude, I believe, or we believe, that we still need to do research on subjective well-being regarding more the process underlying happiness. And this subjective well-being, how is it constructed, how is it thought about, felt about, how it transforms throughout the day, throughout the months, throughout the years, how can it be transmitted from parents to children, from generation to generation, and all this from an individual perspective and in a more qualitative manner. How the process is, we have many figures, but we do know very little about the process or the mechanisms underlying all these numbers and this well-being, the subjective well-being of people in the different countries. Thank you. That's all. Thank you, Joaquina Palomar. Now we get to our last speaker of this panel. We have Margarita Tarragona Saez, who is the director of the Science of Happiness at Tec Milenio University. She's a member of the board of directors of the Association of Positive Psychology. She has a PhD on psychology from the University of Chicago, and she's an expert on relational and personal matters. She is the author of many articles and books on positive psychology. Please, doctor. Thank you. Thank you all. And I was thinking that during lunchtime, Carmelo and I, we were talking about being the last, and it reminded me of a concept of psychology that was studied by Roy Baumeister, who has studied about the power of will and self-control capacity, and that is called ego depletion. It is like how we deplete our capacity to self-control, to control ourselves throughout the day. You are example that there is no self-control depletion, and we are very happy about this. And I was thinking about another discovery, very fortunate, and that comes from Daniel Kahneman. He's a psychologist, but was awarded with an economy prize, and he proposes a theory that is called the peak end, or peak moments and endings. And he says that the most we remember about events are the peaks and also how everything ends. So in our hands it is to finish this. This is a great responsibility. So thank you for being here to attest this. Today, throughout the different presentations, we have heard about positive psychology in a very implicit manner, because the focus of this forum is on public policies from the macro level, from the social context, that are very important. But what I would like to share with you is a little about how, of course, this does not exclude this concept that is so interesting, but from the individual level, what contributes to the well-being of people and the well-being of organizations. I am so happy to direct, and I am lucky to be the director of the Institute of Happiness at the Tec Milenio University, where we are implementing a program that we hope becomes integrated to promote happiness in our students and the people who work for the university. And prior to talking about positive psychology, and I truly love to show this cartoon, because for me it is an example of psychology before positive psychology. I don't know if you're able to see, but it says a National Conference of Adult Children of Normal Parents. So it is like traditional psychology has remarked the idea that we're all neurotic. It has long studied problems, deficits, pathologies, and that is also, of course, very important, and it has historical explanations. Many authors have talked about psychology, practical psychology, and not from the research standpoint, but a practical psychology was consolidated as a clinical psychology from the end of the Second World War. And from then on, the psychological scope has been much regarding to what's missing, what's not good. A while ago, I was in Villahermosa, this city in Mexico, and I was talking to the taxi driver, driving, and he said, "Where are you coming from?" "From Monterrey." "Have you visited Villahermosa earlier?" "Yes." What do you do for a living?" And I said, "I am psychology." And then he stopped. He stopped talking because he said, "I don't want to know about my problems." So this positive psychology emerged from, this comes from the Kenneth Gerger writings. He has been critical of the psychology as a discipline and how it has contributed to our culture. He says that despite the best intentioned psychologists, we have contributed to create a deficit culture because we have mostly approached what doesn't work. And this chart tells us about the number of classifications of mental disorders that were appearing throughout the 20th century. First classification done by Wechsler included 12 disorders, and now the DSM has 2,000 and more than 200. I'm sorry. And this is a culture. We have a culture that every time more the human experience is considered as pathological or problematic. Positive psychology is a movement inside the psychology. It is attributed to, its foundations are attributed to two great personalities, Martin Seligman, that has been mentioned today many times, and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And it says that before this there were many researchers studying on what works well in people: creativity, optimism, happiness. And even before this was studied empirically, but also from the theory standpoint, like Maslow, Adler, and Marie Jehovah as well. And there have been authors that historically have been interested on what's working fine. Daimler is also one of the precursors on the study of happiness. But if there was a map, there would be very, very isolated dots within a context that mostly has devoted its time to study what doesn't work. And Seligman and Dr. Mihaly have been pioneers in a movement that today is very strong. And this is not a discipline by itself. It is orientation within psychology, an orientation that proposes that the good, that what's working fine is the same, is as real, as important to know, and also that we are able to promote as well as the same as what doesn't work, what causes pain, or what brings problems to our life. You know that Carmelo is the president of the International Society of Positive Psychology. So as I said earlier, this is a scientific study of the optimum functioning of people, the factors that contribute to people live fully, or that they flourish. Flourishment, human flourishment. I love this word. So that's why I have this title in my speech of my presentation: a flower that opens and flourishes. So Maslow said that we should not only study the trunks of the trees, but the tips of the branches where flowers grow, in order, as a metaphor, to study human beings. What kind of topics does positive psychology study? Here we have a list: positive emotions, optimum experiences, pleasure and joy. I will not read this list to you because once I heard that the worst a speaker can do is to read the slides. So in general, the phenomena studied by positive psychology can be grouped in regards to their duration in time. On one side, we have positive experiences that last for very brief time, but they have a cumulative effect through time. Dumas Dino was telling us about passing or fleeting emotions, but they impact our happiness. And among positive experiences, we have positive emotions, and we have other experience that I will tell you later on. The positive features refer to more lasting effects, as they are, for example, strengths of character, personality features. These are the positive features of our personalities. Optimism tend to be stable because they are arbitrary ways of thinking to form our own frame of concepts. And something that is even more lasting than emotions and features has to do with positive institutions. Probably the most relevant, or something very relevant for the topics we're dealing with today. Stands as what stands out in those schools that were fine? What stands out cities where people are happy? What makes institutions survive the individuals that founded them? And as I said, human flourishment. This refers to the capacity to fulfill our whole potential to really, really be everything we can be. Is this hypersensitive or what happened? Because it moves, the screen is hypersensitive. Thank you. So we know, as Alejandro Adler mentioned earlier, and one of the advantages or disadvantages of being the last is that many of what we have said has been said earlier. So as Alejandro Adler has said, happiness is not only an end goal, not something desirable by itself, but it has secondary effects or instrumental values. We know that happy people tend to be more successful both at school and at work. They tend to have better interpersonal relations, and these relations promote and foster happiness. So this is when the virtuous circle comes to life. And as Robert Disbastiner told us today when he was telling us about this in research where they inoculated people with the virus of the flu, there is the influence of happiness in the immune system and the cardiovascular system. And when I was listening to what we heard earlier, how does positive psychology study this? By using the tools of general psychology. We have psychometrics, the development of tests and questionnaires, as the example that we just saw by Carmelo on this Pemberton-Hamilton happiness index. Today we have life satisfaction, pessimism, optimism, character strengths, personality strengths, a sense or a meaning of life. We have all these psychometrics that uses the same methodologies, but the approach has changed in order to include now all these other phenomena. We also have experimental psychology. Carmelo, if you want a catalog of all the methodologies that have been used, we have experimental psychology that can occur in a lab or under other conditions. As Alejandro told us, they said a group of schools that had regular school year studies and another group of schools enriched with positive psychology, and they have measured whether there are significant differences. We can use qualitative psychometrics as a research in depth that was suggested today, the very famous study called Grand Study, that was longitudinal study that occurred in more than 60 years with research in depth. We have many methodologies. The fact is that all the tools that psychology has developed in more than a century of existence are now being used with a wider scope that include other phenomena that had to be had been left out. And another thing that we heard, for you to remember, from the psychology perspective, happiness basically has three components. We have the most evident, which is the feelings, the emotions, feeling well, as it was said earlier it was Wenceslao who was telling us, no, Mariano was telling us about, we know we're happy, we feel it. This is the most evident. Another component that has been mentioned today is more cognitive, not as emotional, but how do we satisfy our lives? And parameters get here, many of them have been established culturally. Our knowledge on how life could be and how my life could be or is. And the third element that has been mentioned here, not all theories provided, but it has to do with the transcendence of life, that our lives contribute with something larger than ourselves. And I would like to give you some kind of tasting, very, very small tasting on some of the discoveries from the research of these areas or the components of well-being. And for this, I would like to mention the well-being model established by Martin Seligman, where we have based our model for happiness that we use at Tech Millennium, which is the concept map that we use for creating a well-being map for all the people in our university. Now, to create this model, we reviewed the proposals of integrating models for well-being that were there in the literature. There are so many researchers, and in the last year there have been more than 11,000 articles on well-being and happiness. Its legitimacy as a research topic has been well established. There are many researchers that have talked about the optimism, creativity, resilience, but there are not so many authors that have proposed complete models on what are the elements that largest contribute to the happiness of people. We reviewed 5 models: Dimmer, Carol Reeves, Benton Shahart, and Seligman's, and I don't remember what other. But we found this overlaying so big as it could have been expected, and we found that this is a very good briefing. Can I get back? Okay. So this wheel is a synthesis of what components make people happy. Not everybody has all of them, and not in the same proportion, but if we bet on people having some of part of this as possible, that this person has big scores of well-being. And also we have positive emotions and an optimistic cognitive frame. We have also engagement, which is or relates to being engaged in whatever we do, our activities, our tasks. And also we have interpersonal relations. Some authors say that interpersonal relations are the fast track to happiness, that if you want to bet on something on your life that makes you happier, probably what you have to bet on is in the relations to others. To have a life full of meaning is something important. I only have 5 minutes left. So to have a purpose of life is something central in our life, and to have goals and be able to attain them, have physical well-being and the capacity to be present, fully present in whatever is being done, or what we call mindfulness. So I want to tell you about positive emotions, and I wanted to play with you a very, very brief game on positive emotions. And this is I'm going to show you an image, and you have to say exactly what emotion that is very quickly. Okay, that's joy or bliss, gratitude, very good, curiosity, very good, reflection, serenity, inspiration. This is very difficult. The key comes in the color of the t-shirt, hope, very good. Triumph, success. When we succeed, what do we feel? We feel proud. This is difficult, but this could be amusement. It's difficult. She's painting, therefore she's inspired. This is inspiration. Creativity is not a feeling, but, and this one, awesomeness, or I'm sorry. And or is this love? Love comes hand in hand. And I give you this because Barbara Fredrickson has determined that these emotions, 10 emotions that you have been able to identify so quickly, are those that most of people can experience and can identify most frequently. And we have no time to go into detail, but a very interesting thing we have found with positive psychology is that positive emotions that we did not pay so much attention to earlier are very important to us as a species, and they allow us, on one hand, when people experiment positive emotions in general, they tend to improve several cognitive abilities, as their capacity to be attentive, a short time memory, and also being open to new information. Barbara Fredrickson has provided this theory that tells us about widening and construct. The fact of having a positive emotion as a species allow us to explore the world, open ourselves, and get acquainted and related to the world. Another important subject is engagement or flow experiences. Think recently of one time when you have been so much immersed in what you were doing that time flew by. This is called flow experience, and it has been seen that people who more frequently have these flow experiences tend to be happier. And these flow experiences occur mostly when we face a challenge to which we have an appropriate level of ability or competency. This goes so slow. I'm so sorry. I have only 2 minutes left. But here we are able to see how when we have very little challenge and certain levels of abilities, we get bored. If something it's very difficult, we feel anxious. And we have been able to map the ratio between abilities and challenges. And this is very useful at the school context or the work context mostly. So, and almost to finish, I want to say that a very interesting discovery that seems to be the guiding thread for positive psychology is that our brain or our mind seems to have Velcro for the good things and Teflon for Velcro for the bad things and Teflon for the good things. We tend to remember more the bad things, the criticism, than the flattering, to pay more attention on what's not working compared to what works fine. And in the positive interventions, that are exercises that have been developed to deliberately try to increase the level of well-being in people and for which we have empirical evidence, this can be seen as a conducting thread, an effort to produce Velcro to remember and remember what has been fine. And there is evidence, and we need to have a diary on gratitude, to write about 3 things you feel gratitude for every night. Improves your level of happiness. At a certain dosage, it seems to be, if you do it very, very frequently, it loses power. But on a daily basis, every night, it would be making a list of 3 things that came out right that day and setting why, and writing a gratitude letter. There are exercises that have to do with flavoring, truly savoring what you are eating, the conversation you are having, savoring the moment, getting acquainted with your strengths, choosing one of them and use them in a different manner, different from what you are accustomed to act with generosity. And all these activities that we know impact positively our subjective well-being have in common the possibility of making us set deliberately attention on what we normally tend to set aside. So I have no minutes, no more seconds, so I stop here. Thank you very much.